Just a couple of facts about people with disabilities, which of course is no surprise to any of you, is that the level of employment of people with disabilities, and I'm going to use the term disabled people and people with disabilities interchangeably, in recognition that both forms are quite acceptable depending on which geography you happen to inhabit at any given point in time. So the rate has been very low and has been really low for a long time. I've been looking at the issue of employment and disability since the late 1980s, and there have been some moderate improvements, but basically it's been very low level of employment ever since those days. And as a consequence, people with disabilities are twice as likely to be living in poverty if they're of working age. The situation changes as people get a bit older. All that happens in the context of international human rights declarations, which Canada has signed on to, which indicate that, like anyone else, people with disabilities ought to be able to pursue their own vision of a good life and be in relationships and live in safety and security and, be free, self-determining citizens and so on, and should be free from discrimination in employment. And in terms of the international covenants, people actually have a right to employment, which gets operationalized differently in different jurisdictions. And the antithesis of those values, like exploitation, cruelty, degradation, and so on, are also proscribed. I'd like to say prohibited, but they're not allowed internationally. But when I looked at the quality of people with disabilities work over the years, I find bits and pieces of work on this. I mean, you'll see fairly limited sample size pieces of qualitative work and larger quantitative stuff that will indicate that, well, there's discrimination and there's bad attitudes on the part of employers and coworkers, and people are in workplaces that aren't very supportive, and they're not paid very well, and the work's precarious, and they don't get the hours that they want, and a lot of people are working part-time, and their needs for job accommodations aren't met, and people are sort of clustered in, low-skilled service jobs, and some people are segregated entirely from the labor force. The overall impression that I've drawn over the years is that, it doesn't sound like the work that disabled people have is very good quality. It sort of falls below par. But yet anecdotally, I'm sure we all know examples of people who have got pretty good jobs. And there's even some research that would support that. So it's difficult to make sense, at least I found it difficult to make sense of the quality of work that people have. So to me, like if I wanted to get a sense of the quality of work, I'd be asking about, well, are people discriminated? Were they discriminated in their present job before they got the job? Are they being discriminated at the current workplace? Are there opportunities for advancement? Are they paid reasonably well? Do they get the supports they require to participate on the job? How about their hours of work? Are those suitable given what their needs and interests are and their other priorities? Is the job secure, or is it precarious and sort of moment to moment? Is it likely to evaporate in a year or so, or are they likely to have it over time? Are men and women treated reasonably equally in the workplace? And what about if you're a First Nations person or a person who's from a visible minority community who has a disability? And so forth and so on. So there's a lot of questions that I would have if I were to explore the quality of work that people have. And then the question is, well, how on earth would I make sense of all that, even if I got answers to all of my discrete questions? And the ILO has been working over the years on this notion of decent work, and have put together several documents on this, some of which touch a little bit on people with disabilities. But the generic work on decent work covers 11 substantive elements or dimensions, for which the ILO has given a good number of indicators that ideally states parties to various conventions would be reporting on when they're reporting about the quality of work that people have or the nature of work that people have. And I haven't enumerated how many indicators are in each substantive element, but there's a lot. They have a lot of things that would ideally be in place. And being the kind of person I am, I sort of asked, well, let's look at how many people have all of these elements in place. To the best I could do that using various surveys that I had access to. And I found that nobody does. So, I mean, it's great idealistic stuff. But when push comes to shove, very few people have all the ingredients, so to speak, of decent work. Which then raises the question, well, what about people who have most or some or hardly none of those ingredients? So that led me to a more focused analysis on operationalizing decent work with a focus on people with disabilities. And I drew from the Canadian Survey of Disability, which is the biggest survey in Canada on disability. It has all kinds of information on employment, but on many other subjects as well. And it's linked to the National Household Survey, which has census level data on people's age, gender, and so on. So the two sources of information together yield an amazingly rich source of information on the work and other life dimensions of people with disabilities, and allow for some limited comparative analysis with people who don't have disabilities. And what I set out to do was to develop a composite measure of decent work that takes into account the dimensions of decent work as indicated by the ILO. And there are 11 substantive elements per the ILO's formulation. When I look at the data, I see information that pertains to 8 of those. 3 are kind of off the table, one of which, because is pertaining to a high-level, macro-level indicators of the conditions in a society overall. So really not entirely applicable at the individual workplace level. Another because it deals with work that should be abolished, which pertains mainly to forced labor and child labor, and we simply don't have a lot of that kind of stuff in Canada, although we have work that people would rather not be doing. But the data don't speak directly to those issues. And the data on disability, at least the more current versions, don't really have anything on that would allow you to examine work-life balance, at least not as I read the data. Apologies for the coughing. But I was able to find indicators on 8 of those dimensions. And many of these indicators that I've used are actually composite indicators that draw from more than one variable. So overall, I didn't count them all up, but I used a lot of different variables from the Canadian Survey of Disability to piece together 32, I think it was 32 major indicators that I in turn grouped into 8 substantive elements. I weighted the substantive elements so that each had a value of 1. So we've got 8 equally weighted domains. And I did that because the ILO didn't provide any guidance as to whether or not one domain was more important than the other. And I thought, well, until there's further refinement of that thinking, let's just treat them all the same. And pardon me, the value in doing that is that some domains have a lot of indicators, whereas other domains don't. Substantive elements is what I mean by domain. And if they weren't equally weighted, then the ones that had more indicators would simply have a greater weight in the overall scheme of things. So this is a way of controlling for that. So I developed a decent work master index that consists of 8 major dimensions, and this is what they are, that are equally weighted, which then yields a master index with a lot of scores on it, ranging from 0 to 1. And I in constructing the master index, I added the scores across the 8 substantive elements and then rescaled those so the maximum score would be 1. But even that is difficult to make sense of. So intuitively, it made sense to me to break the master index into three intuitively meaningful units of analysis that reflect a high, medium, and low degree of congruence um, with decent work. And those three categories consist of roughly, or quite similar population counts. So it takes the index and divides it up into three equal parts in terms of the population counts. And for those who are interested, these are the mean scores for the counts that fall within the three categories and the numbers. And these are the standard deviations from the means for the three categories. And you can see that they do tend to cluster around the middle, like the halfway point. And when I plot all of I had to divide the index into increments of 0.05 difference from one another using the points on the scale, because Stats Canada, which is where I got the data from, will only allow release of numbers that meet certain criteria, and if they're too small, they won't release them. So I grouped them into very small units, and when plotted, this is how they look. It falls generally within a nice bell-shaped curve, which sort of surprised me. I thought the pattern would be somewhat odder than that, but it turned out to be fairly even in terms of distribution, with the middle representing the middle and the high and the low representing scores that were high and low. I then, in the detailed report, ran each of the 32 indicators against the 3-point scale. And I'll spare you the details of that, but the general pattern is that, and this is kind of interesting, that for any given indicator with quite a high degree of consistency, except for maybe two, the scores for each of the individual indicators are not much for low quality work, some for high quality work, and even more for some for medium quality work and even more for high quality work. So if I were to ask, well, what percentage of decent quality jobs, high quality jobs, represent people who need and receive all the modified work hours or days that they require, that red bar represents the percentage of the total population that is those people. And the middle bar, the red one in the middle, represents the percentage of work jobs in the middle category, and to the left in the low category. So you can see it's an uphill slope. And I should point out that in terms of the unit of analysis, I focused on the workplace. There are two kind of major units that I flip back and forth between fairly coherently, I hope, in the final report. And one is at the workplace level, and one is at the individual worker level. And I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but I used information gathered about the individual worker to tell the story about what was going on in his or her workplace. And so the information about work is about the work, and it's not about the workers. But then I ask, well, what about the workers? Who has the work? But before I get into that discussion, and this slide breaks every rule of good slide making, but I've put it out just to show you that the pattern is that where you have high quality work, low, middle, and high, the green bars represent the percentage of the high quality work that have these indicators in them, and low, the red, green, good, red, not so good, represent the percentage of low quality jobs that have these features. So then asking, well, what sorts of jobs are we talking about? Like, which occupations are more likely to provide decent work? So then I used the knock, the broad, I think it's 10 or 11 word knock variable, to run that against the 3-point scale. And again, there are some small differences and some larger differences. So I thought that, well, if there's a 20% difference from the overall average, that strikes me as being a fairly substantial difference. So let's just focus on those things for now. So occupations with at least 1.2 times the average percentage of high quality jobs turned out to be natural and applied sciences and related occupations, health, education, law, social and community services, and manufacturing and utilities. And the low quality jobs turned out to be management jobs, which I found kind of surprising. Art, culture, recreation, and sport, and natural resources, agriculture, and related. And some of you intuitively will say, yeah, that makes sense. Like musicians don't, it's pretty precarious work and they're not very well paid. Neither are artists or poets. And people working in farming, well, it's a lot of day laborers and people working for very low wages and so on. So as a tool then, the 3-point scale helps to illuminate where the higher quality and the lower quality occupations are, the nature of those occupations. And if one had time and if the sample size were large enough, one could probably dig inside these occupational groups and do further fine group analysis. I asked, well, what are the contributing factors to this? And I won't go into great detail on this, but I did generate means for the occupations by each of the 8 substantive elements using the master index means, and found that occupations with substantially more high quality jobs than expected had more social dialogue and representation, meaning greater degree of unionization in health, education, law, government services, manufacturing, utilities, higher score for earnings and supports from productivity, and a higher score for equal opportunities in treatment and employment in natural resources, applied sciences, and health. And also these things, but in addition, safe and accessible work environments in natural and applied sciences. So you can see that the tool, using sort of a combination of the means and the 3-point scale, helped to drill into the specific domains where some occupations are scoring higher than others. So you get some sense of why the scores are better in some domains or in some occupations than in others. And again, if one had more time, you could burrow more deeply into the fine print in the substantive elements and see whether or not, well, is the relatively high score for earnings and productivity because of really good performance in payment money, or is it because of more availability of supports for participation, or just where are the big advantages of a particular occupational group? And I looked at the factors that contribute to low quality occupations. And because we're running short on time, I won't go into all the detail. Did the same for the industrial groupings, the types of jobs using industry as the unit of analysis, and pulled out the industries where people seem to be working to a greater degree than expected, significantly greater degree than expected in high quality versus low quality jobs, and then provided some explanatory factors that help account for the relatively high showing in high quality jobs, and then the unexpectedly large numbers of low quality jobs in various industries. In asking who's most likely to have decent work, I used kind of standard dimensions of socio-demographic characteristics that you would expect. And I found surprisingly that women, older workers, lone parents, unattached people living alone, and people living above the poverty line, which is the big surprise, were slightly more likely to be in higher quality versus lower quality work. And so now I have a bunch of questions about that I wasn't able to address in the research, because this has already generated a lot of questions that I've been trying to answer. So I guess another way would be, well, let's look further at the characteristics of people who've gotten what seem to be pretty good work compared with those who have gotten what seem to be not so good work. Also, and this wouldn't be a surprise to most on the line, people with higher educational certification. And the way that the coding was organized to pick up, it's particularly sensitive to where people need and receive accommodations for employment, various types of supports for productivity and access. And so it's perhaps to be expected that there's slightly greater representation of people with more severe levels of disability. But when looking at whether or not people are limited at work because of their disability, whether they say that they're limited at work, it's a fairly even split in each of the three categories. It's a bit higher in high quality versus low quality, but it's not markedly so. What is different is that people in higher quality jobs were way more likely, if they feel limited at work, to have been with their present employer since the onset of disability. So the lesson I draw from this is that if you go to an employer with a work-limiting job disability, you're less likely to get high quality work. You're more likely to get it if you become disabled sort of after establishing a track record with the employer. I then mapped out which occupational groups have substantially more people with selected disabilities in high, medium, and low quality jobs. And I subdivided by intellectual, psychological, emotional, hearing, learning, and I removed people with developmental or intellectual disability from that particular derivation to just focus on people who indicated there was difficulty with learning, but not developmental disability. Seeing, physical, which I included people with mobility, dexterity, and flexibility issues. And then, like, pain is ubiquitous in the CSD, so I focused on people who reported pain only as their only disability. And just to show you what's doable, I've indicated where people with various disabilities were significantly more, meaning 1.2 times more, or significantly less likely to have low quality or high quality jobs, or medium quality jobs. And that's what the L, H, and M stands for. It's a bit of a difficult table to interpret and to explain quickly, but just to show you that this can be done. And I have done that for types of occupations as well, or types of industries as well. So some takeaway messages for me when looking on all the detail for occupations and industries is that there are some overarching patterns, which we don't have time to go into today. But disability, the nature of people's disability is also important. And it helps explain why some people with particular disabilities seem to be overrepresented in some occupations and industries, but less so in others. And then there are some common patterns, like management seems to be something that a lot of people have difficulty with, regardless of the type of disability. But health-related occupations seem to be good for a lot of people, irrespective of type of disability. And then you've got people with intellectual disability who seem to be doing particularly well in some occupations. I think retail was one of them, but not so well in others. But others don't do well in that sector. So there's differential patterns for people according to the type of disability they have, which is quite consistent with a social model of disability way of framing the relationship between impairment and environment. So some implications of all this, and I've broken it out for employment agencies, for governments, and then for governments and agencies. And one would be that I think using this model, it is possible, based on the information that agencies are already gathering, And then maybe by adding a couple of other fairly straightforward questions that already have a pedigree in the research literature on whether people feel their job is enabling them to use all their skills and knowledge, or whether or not they feel they have enough money to pay the bills and get by. But generally speaking, agencies would have a lot of the information that they require in order to generate a kind of a 3-point decent work scale, so they can begin assessing the nature and the quality of the work that they're getting for their clients. And they could track migrations of clients across low to high, or even within high, like from one type of job to another type of job. All of which could be used to, explain the results that they're obtaining with their funding, which perhaps they could use with funders to obtain more funding, which they could use to just, improve their performance. If they're consistently getting people into low quality jobs and they don't seem to be moving anywhere beyond that, then that tells an agency something. For governments, my view is that, well, if governments have this sort of information, they could track trends over time. Because right now, often what gets reported is the employment rate, period. Like, we don't really know a whole lot about the nature of people's work, and people get kind of depressed or a bit happier if the rate goes up or down a bit. But we don't know whether that's movement into stable employment rate overall, but a lot of migration into high quality from low quality jobs. We just don't have that information, haven't done that work. So it could help governments, and it could help them to think about the nature of their investments and what agencies are doing. I would say not so much to punish agencies that aren't doing what governments would like them to do, but rather to reward the agencies that are doing good work consistently. And you can showcase agencies that seem to be achieving really good results with public funding. Again, for both governments and agencies, they can track trends over time. It can inform their goal setting, and it can be used. That information can be used to show employers that actually there are lots of people in your sector who are working in good jobs, and here's the kinds of jobs we're talking about. And so maybe you want to consider hiring more of these individuals who seem to be doing quite well in your sector. I have several ideas about follow-up research, but I think I've gone a little bit further than I should have gone already, so I'll stop it now. Oh, I can go? Okay. Well, for me, some questions are, like, if we've got this, if we have a tool for assessing kind of the quality of people's work, a real obvious question to me is, well, when people approach employers with a work limiting disability, who's getting the good quality jobs and who's getting the crummy jobs? And like, where are those occupations and what industries are those jobs in? So I've already mentioned that this model so far, the way I've used it so far, speaks to a certain degree to job retention. So if we were to just sort of ignore everybody else except for people who approached employers with a work limiting disability, where are people getting high quality versus low quality jobs? Who are the people who are getting high quality versus low quality jobs? What are the factors that help explain the jobs that people are getting? Is it the personal characteristics of the people? Or is it the nature of the supports that are in place or perhaps not in the jobs? And it's probably going to be a combination of the two things. And why are there these kind of strange patterns? Like, why different patterns by type of disability and the quality of work across groups? And why do some occupational and industry groups seem to consistently yield low quality results, low quality employment? Why do some occupational groups have high quality work like health, education, law, and so forth? And then if you take an industry like a combination of food services, some people seem to be doing quite well. Some people are doing okay, medium quality jobs, and a lot of people are doing not very well at all. Well, how do we explain that sort of pattern? And I think too, I can't speak for anybody else, but I know of myself, I've been guilty of a kind of an occupational discrimination, tending to think of, oh, that's just a low quality, it comes back to one of those jobs. but actually one of those jobs may be perfectly suitable to someone who's got that level of skill, that much time on their hands, and those kinds of interests. I mean, maybe exactly what they want. So, and other sorts of jobs that may be really high quality or high skilled and high demand and high pressure and lots of hours. Maybe a lot of people actually don't want those sorts of jobs. So I think it may be a little bit of an antidote to a kind of a occupational discrimination to see that actually some sectors may be quite well suited for some folks and others for other folks. But we'd also have to be careful, of course, about entering into a kind of a reverse or a new form of discrimination and stereotyping and all that. I get. Another thing that needs to be done, I think, is to derive reasonably comparable measure of decent work for people who don't have disability, and do comparative work there too to track the patterns over time, the comparative patterns. And there's a bit of work to be done in order to get to that next step. I tried to do that in this research, but realized pretty early on that it was going to take more time and more effort than I had at my disposal. So I just focused on the disability piece, but I think there's enough there now that I could go back and do the piece for people without disabilities and be able to pull something together across various surveys. So that's sort of where I've gotten to. I have an appendix that has a kind of a list of indicators that are in each of the substantive elements, but that's probably enough for now. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Cam. With that, we're at the question and answer part of the webinar. So I'm going to start with the two questions we have. Canadian Survey of Disability. How are people with disabilities identified? I'm currently disabled, but don't know that anyone in government or survey organizations would be aware that I am disabled since I have chosen to retire early and leave the employment market. Is it possible that many people are missing in terms of surveying?
Thanks for the question. There's a couple of answers to different aspects of your question. And how Stats Canada captures the universe of people that they define as having a disability is actually kind of a complicated question to answer in a brief time period. But what they do is they ask some high-level probes on the census, and then if they get any yes responses to those questions, they then ask a selected number of people that are randomly drawn within certain parameters, a whole bunch of questions on impairment and difficulties with various activities, with seeing and mobility and learning and doing this, that, and the other thing. And if at the end of all of those questions people have yes responses, depending on how many and where the yes responses are, they're flagged as having a disability. There's some people who say, well, they have a little bit of difficulty now and again, and those people tend to be moved to one side as having something perhaps less than a disability. It's a sample survey, so not everyone in the country is asked the questions, and even the piece from the census that they use to construct the sample is itself a sample. So it's sort of like a sample within a sample. So not everyone in the country is asked the questions. But that said, there are tens of thousands of people with various kinds of disability that are asked the questions. My work looks only at people who said they have a disability and who were employed. So it doesn't include people who were looking for work or people who were not working because they had either retired or because they became discouraged and gave up looking for work. And that's those really important set of questions around all these folks. And my piece is much more limited. It just looks at the quality of work that people are currently engaged in.
Thank you, Cam. Can you expand on the differences between professions, jobs for individuals with intellectual disabilities versus physical disabilities?
Well, the occupations are based on kind of a rubric that Stats Canada has developed for levels of education, levels of skill, I think experience. I forget all that goes into it, but it's kind of like a complex mix of factors that goes into designating which occupational group a person would belong to. So these high-level 10 category groupings are just that. They're groupings that bunch a whole whack of people together into a single group. And you can go into much more detail than what the 10 category group provides. And same with industries, they're all grouped too. So I don't know if that answers your question, but people with intellectual disabilities are distributed more in some occupations and industries than others. I didn't go into a great deal of detail on that.
Okay, thank you, Cam. How do you account for the reality of women, especially marginalized women, being less likely to identify with disability or as disabled than white men, and or who would also consider their job as decent because their expectations for quality are perhaps lower?
Okay, well, I'll take the last part of it first. How would I account for the reality that women would consider their job decent because their expectations for quality are perhaps lower? If you've only been exposed to a limited range of possibilities, you may well fall into the view that you've got it pretty well. And Marcia Sen, I think, was one of the people who wrote about that internationally, and there are lots of others, of course. But kind of you scale expectations according to the opportunities to which you've been exposed. Not much opportunity, expectations are much lower. How do you account for the reality of racialized women being less likely to identify with a disability rather than white men? I think, well, as a friend of mine pointed out many years ago, there's hardly a queue of people lining up to say they have a disability. You know, it brings its own social stigma with it. And if there are already layers of disadvantage that come with being a woman, a racialized woman, then appropriating or identifying with yet another dimension could make life even more difficult. And so people are reluctant to do that in surveys and in other situations, social situations. So perhaps that answers the question I hope it proposed.
Thank you, Cam. One of your slides showed that even higher people with high-level jobs, or less than 30%, get the modifications they need and request. Are there any other factors that enable them to stay employed? That's the first question, so I'll let you answer that first.
Yeah, there's a multitude of factors, Margaret, that enable people to stay employed. My PhD kind of goes into that. My question in the PhD was a bit more focused on people obtaining work after the onset of disability, and perhaps detailed regression analysis that focuses only on people who are employed and who had their disability while with their present employer would be another useful avenue to explain retention. But it would include things like the occupational insure, the nature of disability, whether people are receiving the supports they require, whether or not they're being paid enough. Like, why hang around to do a job if you don't feel you're being paid well enough? What about if you're being discriminated against in employment? You can't get promotions, why hang around? Or why would your employer keep you if they feel they don't like people like you in the workplace? So there would be all kinds of answers to that. Which ones would come to the top as most important, I don't know. I suspect the fit between what the person wants to do and what the employer wants them to do would be key to that. And that probably has something to do with the skill set and the connection with the skill set the person has got and the knowledge and experience, and what the occupation in a given industry requires, I'm guessing.
Thank you. The second part of that question was, have you published anything on the study yet? Have you published anything?
No, I haven't. I am going to publish something soon on this. And I will send you slides. I'll send you some of the slides. I'm not going to send you all of the slides, but I can make some slides available, sure.
How do you account for the 1.2 lower rate of management occupations? I would have thought they would be considered better jobs.
Yeah, I mean that's the myth. that's out there, and it's been out there for a long time. So why is that? Exactly. That's one of the questions I'd like an answer to as well. And I simply haven't had time to go and answer that. I'll probably do some noodling away and may not write it up. But I think that's exactly the sort of question this approach to analysis gives rise to. I suspect it may have something to do with the lack of union representation for managers. It may also have something to do with high hours of work, and perhaps not being accommodated for the work hours that one would like to be accommodated. Maybe people would like to be working less and they're not. Those are two things that come to mind as being probably in the mix, but I just wouldn't want to answer further than that at this point.
Is there sensitivity in the measures to correlate the likelihood of accommodations to higher satisfaction rankings?
You mean, have I control for whether people who have got accommodations are more likely to feel satisfied in their work? Yes and no. I mean, to the extent that people feel that, like there used to be a great question in the old PALS survey on whether people feel that their job gives them opportunities, full opportunities to use their knowledge, skills, and experience. And I would take a yes to that question as an indicator that people are probably well fitted to the job that they're in. And unfortunately, the CSD doesn't ask that question. But they do ask some other questions about whether or not, because of their disability, people would have a hard time advancing in their present job or finding another job. And so for me, it's close to a job satisfaction kind of thing. And what I've found in doing this analysis is that, and I haven't done a point-by-point analysis of each detailed indicator, but the overall pattern is that the yes responses to the indicators are in the high quality group. So there's some relationship here between having accommodations and being feeling okay about the job that you're in, and that there seems to be a good fit. So it wouldn't surprise me if one were to ask a point-blank question, do you like your job, of people who do and don't get accommodations, that there would be a high correlation. So the short answer is that there's sort of a correlation that's implied in what I've done, but I haven't brought it into the foreground.
Okay, thank you, Cam. Were you able to take into account regional variances? For example, were there higher satisfaction in some regions, where nationally the rank may be lower?
Yeah, there were some differences. They weren't major. I talk about them a little bit, and I think there were higher than expected proportions of people with good quality jobs in New Brunswick and I forget where else. So I didn't spend a lot of time writing about that detail. It struck me that the patterns were kind of like outliers. There wasn't like a major shift, like all of Atlantic Canada is doing way worse. That didn't seem to be a pattern, as I recall. And I certainly didn't dwell on the regional variations. I was more interested at this point in the occupations and industries. But that information is in the full report.
Great, thank you. I believe that we've come to the end of the session. So I want to thank Cam very much for presenting us with his PhD work research today. Oh, sorry, my slip up, his postdoc research. Thank you very much for the time that you've spent here, Cam.
Yeah, and I would like to thank as well the Center for Research on Disability Work Policy for funding to do this work. It couldn't have happened without that funding, and I'm really grateful for it. And thanks to all of you for your patience with the technical difficulties and with whatever complexity you had to bear with in my answers to your